My husband ripped my name card from the center VIP table at our daughter's birthday party and told me to sit in the back near the kitchen doors. He said my working class vibe embarrassed his wealthy father. What he did not know was that I was a forensic accountant, and by that evening, I would sell the $2 million house he lived in, freeze every bank account he had, and hand him over to the federal government. My name is Clara. I am 33 years old, and I spent the last 2 years quietly building the ultimate trap for the family that treated me like dirt. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through an insult while secretly planning your revenge. Trust me, you will want to hear how this exact moment became the downfall of an entire fake empire. It was a crisp Saturday afternoon in suburban Chicago. The Oak Brook Country Club ballroom was dripping with expensive floral arrangements, massive pastel balloon arches, and a custom dessert bar that cost more than my first car. It was my daughter Lily's 7th birthday party. For 3 long months, I had meticulously planned every single detail. I negotiated with the exclusive vendors, selected the gourmet catering menu, and quietly paid the entire $15,000 invoice from my own private bank account. I did this because my husband Jason always insisted his wealth was temporarily tied up in his father's prestigious investment firm. I was standing near the center table, adjusting a stray linen napkin, feeling the familiar ache in my lower back from running around since dawn to make everything perfect. Lily was across the room laughing joyfully with her friends in her sparkling princess dress. For a brief second, I felt a wave of genuine happiness. Then I heard the sharp, aggressive click of Jason's leather shoes approaching from behind. Jason did not even bother to say hello or thank me for setting up the gorgeous venue. He walked straight past me, his jaw set in that arrogant line I had grown to absolutely despise over the years. He reached across the pristine white tablecloth, grabbed the gold-foiled place card bearing my name, and crumpled it aggressively in his fist. I watched in stunned silence as he turned and threw it toward table number 8. A cramped, poorly lit table shoved right next to the noisy swinging doors of the catering kitchen. I asked him what on earth he thought he was doing. Jason stepped uncomfortably close to me, lowering his voice into a vicious, mocking hiss. He told me to go sit in the back right now. He said his father Richard was arriving any minute with 3 major investors from New York, and he did not want my cheap working-class vibe embarrassing the family. He actually looked me up and down with pure disgust, as if the elegant silk dress I wore was somehow offensive to his supposed high society standards. He told me I was just lucky they even let me host the party at their club, and that I needed to remember my place when real money was in the room. My heart pounded heavily against my ribs. Any other wife might have broken down crying right there. Any other woman might have caused a massive scene, throwing a glass of champagne in his face and ruining her daughter's birthday party in front of 50 wealthy guests. But I was not just any wife. I was a professional auditor who specialized in uncovering complex financial crimes. I knew the absolute truth about his real money and his father's fake business. I simply looked at the crumpled name card lying on the carpet, then looked back at my husband's smug face. I did not scream. I did not argue. I just smoothed the fabric of my dress and gave him a chillingly polite smile. I told him I understood perfectly. I told him I would stay completely out of his way so he and his father could impress their important guests. Jason smirked, clearly mistaking my strategic retreat for weakness and submission. He turned his back on me to greet the arriving guests, puffing out his chest like a proud peacock. He had absolutely no idea that his arrogant little command was the final piece of the puzzle I needed to destroy him. As I walked toward the back of the room, my phone vibrated quietly in my pocket. It was a confirmation text from my real estate attorney. Everything was perfectly aligned. The trap was finally set. The heavy double doors of the country club ballroom swung open with a dramatic thud. A sudden hush fell over the room as the guests turned their attention to the entrance. Richard had arrived. My father-in-law walked in wearing a pristine charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that I knew for an absolute fact was purchased on a platinum credit card I was secretly paying off. He carried himself with the inflated arrogance of a Wall Street titan, his head held high, expecting the entire room to cater to his mere presence. Behind him trailed my sister-in-law Naomi, clutching a designer handbag like a shield, and her husband Jamal. Jamal was the only decent person in that entire bloodline. He was a senior risk analyst for a major commercial bank, a sharp and observant man who always looked slightly out of place among the superficiality of my husband's family. As they entered, Jamal caught my eye and gave me a tight, sympathetic smile. He could clearly see I had been banished to the dusty corner by the kitchen doors, but he also knew his place in the family hierarchy and stayed quiet to keep the peace. Richard did not even look in my direction. It was a psychological power move he had perfected over the last 5 years. If he did not acknowledge me, I simply did not exist. He walked right past me, his expensive cologne leaving a suffocating trail in the air, and headed straight for the dessert table, where Lily was happily picking at a vanilla cupcake. He leaned down and patted my daughter's head with a stiff, unnatural motion that looked completely forced. Then he loudly cleared his throat and looked around at the towering floral arrangements and the custom backdrop I had spent weeks designing. He let out a heavy, theatrical sigh, making sure his booming voice carried over the soft jazz playing in the background. He announced to Jason that it was a terrible shame such a beautiful grandchild had to suffer through such a cheap, unimaginative birthday party. He gestured vaguely at the room and remarked that the centerpieces looked like they were bought from a dollar store clearance bin. He said it was deeply embarrassing to host his New York investors in a room that smelled like desperation and poor breeding. He looked directly at Lily and said, "It is a tragedy you inherited your mother's pedestrian taste." Naomi giggled from behind him, immediately chiming in to agree. She loudly whispered to Jason that I had probably tried to do the decorations myself to save a few pennies, completely ignoring the fact that the gourmet dessert bar alone cost more than her entire wedding dress. I stood motionless by the swinging kitchen doors, my hands gripping the cold edge of a stainless steel serving table. I bit my tongue so hard, I tasted copper. This was the historical dynamic of my marriage. This was the role I was forced to play day in and day out. I was the convenient punching bag, the uncultured girl from a blue-collar neighborhood who was supposed to be endlessly grateful that this prestigious elite family had taken her in. For years I had swallowed their passive-aggressive remarks. I smiled through agonizing family dinners where Richard would openly mock my public university degree. I stayed silent when Naomi called my clothes outdated and cheap. I endured it all because I loved Jason, and for a long time I genuinely believed his empty promises that things would get better once his father finally retired. But standing there watching Richard sip top-shelf liquor that I had funded, watching him tear down the beautiful day I built for my daughter, I felt absolutely zero pain. I only felt a cold, calculated clarity. The irony of his insult was almost poetic. Richard loved to play the billionaire patriarch, but I knew the exact balance of every single one of his bank accounts. I had seen the forged loan applications. I knew the expensive suit he was wearing was bought with stolen funds. They called me a gold digger for years, oblivious to the fact that their entire empire was a hollow shell, propped up by my flawless credit score and my stolen identity. Jamal shifted uncomfortably, clearly disturbed by Richard's cruel comment to a 7-year-old child. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to defend the beautiful party setup, but Richard sharply cut him off. Richard demanded a glass of scotch and turned his back completely to the room. The dismissal was absolute. The patriarch had spoken, and the working-class wife was expected to vanish into the background. I took a deep breath, letting the anger wash over me and evaporate. I did not need to scream or defend my taste. I just needed to execute the next phase of my plan. I moved smoothly away from the swinging kitchen doors, leaving the heavy scent of my father-in-law's expensive cologne behind. I walked across the plush carpet, navigating around the towering centerpieces I had painstakingly designed, straight toward the dessert bar where my daughter was standing. Lily looked up at me, her face smeared with a tiny bit of vanilla frosting. Her bright eyes searched my face, sensing the shift in the room's energy even at 7 years old. She was too young to understand the toxicity of the people around her, and I was determined to keep it that way for as long as possible. I knelt down so I was right at her eye level, ignoring the fact that my expensive silk dress was brushing against the floor. I brushed a stray curl behind her ear and smiled the most genuine, reassuring smile I could muster. I pulled her in for a tight hug, breathing in the sweet scent of sugar and childhood innocence. I leaned in close and whispered softly in her ear so no one else could hear. I told her that Mommy had to run a very important errand, but that she should have the best time with her friends. Then I told her the magic words. I said there was a secret present waiting for her back at home, and I would see her very soon to open it together. Her eyes lit up with instant excitement, completely forgetting the awkward tension Richard had just brought into the room. She threw her arms around my neck, gave me a sticky kiss on the cheek, and ran off to join the other children at the craft station. I stood up, picked up my purse from a nearby chair, and turned toward the exit. I did not walk out the grand main doors where the valet was waiting. I headed straight for the swinging double doors of the catering kitchen. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught Jason watching me. He was standing near the portable bar with Naomi gripping a crystal tumbler of scotch. He had a smug, self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. As I pushed open the heavy kitchen door, I heard his voice carry over the music. He was bragging to his sister. He laughed and said that sometimes you just have to use a little tough love to remind people where they stand. He told Naomi that I was finally learning my place in the family hierarchy and that a firm hand always kept me in line. Naomi nodded in eager agreement, praising her brother for handling the situation like a true alpha male. They were so utterly blind. Jason thought he had just asserted his dominance. He thought he had humiliated me into submission in front of his precious family. What he completely failed to realize was that he had just handed a certified forensic accountant the single greatest gift imaginable. He gave me an airtight, publicly witnessed alibi. By aggressively ordering me to leave the party, and by loudly bragging about it to the guests, he ensured that dozens of people could testify that I was forcefully removed from the premises by my husband. When the financial bombs started detonating later that afternoon, no one would be able to claim I was standing by his side as a willing co-conspirator. Jason had just legally severed me from the blast radius of his own destruction. The heavy kitchen doors swung shut behind me, instantly cutting off the soft jazz and the murmurs of the wealthy guests. The catering kitchen was a chaotic blur of clinking plates, shouting chefs, and hissing espresso machines. A few of the servers cast sympathetic glances my way, having clearly heard the commotion in the ballroom. But I did not need their pity. My posture was perfectly straight. My heart was no longer racing. It beat with a slow, methodical rhythm. I walked past the stainless steel prep tables and pushed through the rear exit door, stepping out into the crisp, cool autumn air of the loading dock. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind me, echoing like a judge's gavel. The transition was instant. Inside that ballroom, I was the oppressed working-class wife they loved to belittle. Out here in the quiet parking lot, I was the absolute architect of their downfall. I walked across the gray asphalt toward my black SUV, replaying his words in my head. Sit in the back. Those words were going to cost him everything. In my profession, we look for patterns of behavior. Jason's pattern was a desperate need to feel superior, a tragic flaw inherited directly from Richard. They were so busy maintaining the illusion of power that they never bothered to check the foundational pillars holding up their lavish lifestyle. They assumed my silence meant ignorance. They assumed my patience meant weakness. I unlocked my car and climbed into the driver's seat, shutting the door to enclose myself in total silence. I took a deep breath, the expensive leather of the interior a stark reminder of the assets I was about to liquidate. Jason thought he had banished me to the shadows. He was right. But he forgot that the shadows are exactly where predators do their best work. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop. The interior of my SUV was a sanctuary of silence, a stark contrast to the thumping bass and forced laughter echoing from the country club behind me. I settled into the plush leather of the driver's seat, the lingering chill of the autumn air seeping through the cracked window. I reached into my oversized tote bag and pulled out my silver laptop, resting it firmly on my knees. The screen flickered to life, casting a harsh, pale glow across my face in the dim light of the parking lot. My hands hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second. This was the point of no return. But honestly, the point of no return had been crossed a long time ago. Jason and his father loved to mock my education. They called my degree from a state university pedestrian, constantly comparing it to their supposed Ivy League pedigree. What they conveniently ignored, or perhaps were too arrogant to understand, was what my degree was actually in. I am a forensic accountant. I do not just balance spreadsheets or file tax returns. I am a financial detective. In my world, numbers speak the absolute truth. People lie, signatures can be forged, and balance sheets can be manipulated, but the flow of money leaves a permanent, undeniable trail if you know exactly where to look. I hunt down missing assets, I trace laundered money across offshore accounts, and I unravel complex corporate frauds for a living. I am the person federal agencies hire when wealthy men try to hide their dirty money. Jason thought I was just a naive wife who spent her days decorating the house and organizing playdates. He had absolutely no idea that he had invited an apex predator right into the center of his financial web. The unraveling began exactly 2 years and 14 days ago. It started with a single seemingly insignificant piece of mail. Jason had carelessly left a statement from a secondary bank on the kitchen counter. He brushed it off as a clerical error when I asked about it, but the numbers simply did not align with the narrative he and Richard had been feeding me. That one loose thread was all I needed to start pulling. Once I started, the entire fabric of their fake billionaire lifestyle completely disintegrated. For 24 months, I lived a double life. During the day, I was the dutiful, submissive daughter-in-law enduring Richard's endless insults and Jason's patronizing lectures. But late at night, long after Jason had fallen into a deep sleep, I was in my home office quietly archiving every single piece of data flowing through the family network. I tracked the wire transfers. I mapped out the complex web of shell companies. I downloaded the forged loan applications. The most painful discovery was not that Richard was broke, but that Jason had actively conspired with him to steal my identity. I remember the exact moment the final puzzle piece snapped into place. I found a hidden directory Jason thought he had wiped clean. They had used my pristine credit score and my social security number to secure millions of dollars in fraudulent commercial loans. They forged my signature on documents that placed the entire burden of their failing business squarely on my shoulders. When I found that folder of forged documents, the last remaining shred of love I had for Jason died instantly. It was permanently replaced by a cold, calculating drive for absolute justice. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop. I opened a highly secure encrypted browser window that I had custom-built for this exact day. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in the complex string of passwords and authentication keys. I navigated directly to the master portal of the Apex Financial Group, the primary banking interface that controlled every single asset, credit line, and liquid cash reserve connected to the family name. Because they had illegally used my identity to set up the foundation of these accounts, I was legally registered as the primary guarantor. They thought they had locked me out by holding the daily passwords, completely forgetting that I was the one who understood the security architecture of the bank they were defrauding. With a few swift keystrokes, I bypassed their secondary authorizations and hit enter. I systematically locked out the addresses associated with Jason's phone and Richard's office. The loading wheel spun for 2 agonizing seconds before the screen refreshed. There it was. The entire financial lifeline of Jason and Richard laid bare in front of me. Every checking account, every platinum credit card, every corporate expense line. They were currently sitting inside that ballroom drinking expensive scotch and playing the role of untouchable titans of industry. But sitting out here in the quiet isolation of my car, I held their entire world in the palm of my hand. My finger rested gently on the trackpad, hovering right over the master control settings. The execution phase was officially authorized. I pressed down on the trackpad. A small click echoed in the quiet cabin of my car, a sound so tiny but incredibly destructive. On the screen, a green confirmation bar loaded across the top of the banking portal. It read, Access revoked successfully. Just like that, the first pillar of their fake empire crumbled into dust. I navigated to the Secondary Authorizations tab and selected the 4 platinum credit cards that Jason and Richard used for everything. These were the heavy metal cards they casually tossed onto tables at expensive steakhouses, the cards they used to fund their luxury car leases and golf memberships. They loved the prestige those cards brought them. But the account was built entirely on my stolen credit profile. I was the primary account holder. I clicked the freeze option on every single piece of plastic bearing their names. Another green confirmation bar appeared. I sat back against the leather seat and let out a long, slow breath. For years, they had weaponized money against me. They used their supposed wealth to make me feel small, to remind me that I was just a working-class girl who should be grateful for their charity. But looking at the master ledger, the truth was hilariously pathetic. Their liquidity was virtually zero. Every single dollar they spent today was borrowed money leveraged against my name. By freezing those cards, I was not just cutting off their spending money, I was completely paralyzing them. The transition in my mind was absolute. I was no longer the humiliated wife banished to the back of the room. I was the mastermind pulling the strings of their financial survival. I pictured Jason inside the ballroom right at that very moment. He was probably standing at the custom bar I paid for, laughing with his father's New York investors, acting like he owned the entire world. He would be holding his glass of scotch, waiting to order another round of expensive drinks to impress them. He had no idea that his wallet was now completely useless. He was financially stranded at a party his banished wife had fully funded. The irony was almost too sweet to bear. I closed the banking portal and securely logged out, wiping the browser history and encrypting the drive just as a standard precaution. I closed the laptop, the screen going dark, leaving me in the quiet dimness of the parking lot. I placed the computer back into my tote bag and reached for the ignition button. The engine of my SUV roared to life, breaking the silence around me. I shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled out of my parking space. I drove past the grand front entrance of the country club where valets were busy organizing the luxury cars of the guests inside. I did not look back. There was no hesitation and absolutely no regret. I had given Jason 1,000 chances to be a real husband, to be a protector, to be an honest man. He chose to be his father's puppet instead. He chose to humiliate me in public to feed his own fragile ego. Now he was going to experience what it actually feels like to be completely powerless. As I merged onto the main road leading away from the club, my phone screen lit up in the cup holder. It was another text from my attorney confirming that the real estate transaction was moving into the final closing phase. The credit cards were only the appetizer. The main course was going to be the house. I drove through the affluent suburban streets, watching the colorful autumn leaves blow across the road. The weather was beautiful, completely at odds with the storm I had just unleashed. I thought about Lily safe inside with her friends, entirely shielded from the ugly reality of her father's incoming meltdown. She was the only reason I had stayed as long as I did, and she was the exact reason I was finally tearing it all down. I knew it would not take long for the reality to hit them. Jason would inevitably try to swipe his card for a premium bottle of champagne or to tip the catering staff. He would see that embarrassing red declined message on the machine. He would assume it was a simple bank glitch he could fix with an angry phone call. He would never in a million years suspect that the woman he just ordered to sit in the back had orchestrated the entire thing. The burndown had officially begun, and there was absolutely no way to put out the fire. I pressed my foot on the gas pedal and headed toward my next destination, ready to execute Phase 2. Back inside the Oak Brook Country Club, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of roasted tenderloin and expensive perfumes. Jason was leaning against the polished mahogany of the custom bar, completely in his element. He was flanked by his father Richard and the 3 wealthy investors from New York. They were laughing loudly at a joke Richard had just told, the kind of booming artificial laughter that wealthy men use to signal their status to the room. Jason felt absolutely invincible. He had just successfully banished me to the back of the room, proving to his father that he had his house in order and his wife under his thumb. Now it was time to prove he had the capital to play in their league. Jason caught the attention of the head bartender with a sharp snap of his fingers. It was a rude and incredibly arrogant gesture, but Jason believed wealth excused terrible manners. He ordered a bottle of their most expensive vintage champagne, a reserve label that cost $500 a bottle. He announced to the investors that they needed to toast to their upcoming joint venture, acting as if $500 was nothing more than pocket change. The investors nodded in polite approval, clearly expecting a lavish display of hospitality. The bartender retrieved the frosted green bottle from the illuminated glass display case and placed it on the bar counter. Jason reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his sleek, heavy metal platinum credit card. He tossed it onto the polished wood with a satisfying clink. He did not even bother to look at the bartender, keeping his eyes locked on the New York guests as he continued to boast about his supposed real estate acquisitions and his future plans for expansion. The bartender picked up the heavy card and slid it through the card reader. A few seconds passed as the machine processed the data. Then the small digital screen flashed a bright, unforgiving red. The word "declined" appeared in bold black letters. The bartender frowned, assuming he had simply swiped it too fast. He tried it again deliberately, wiping the magnetic strip on his dark apron first to ensure a clean read. Swipe, loading. The red screen illuminated his face. Declined. The bartender cleared his throat softly and leaned forward over the mahogany bar, trying to be as discreet as possible. He quietly informed Jason that the card was not going through and asked if he had an alternative form of payment. Jason stopped talking mid-sentence. He looked at the machine, then at the bartender, his arrogant smile faltering for a split second. The New York investors fell completely silent, their eyes dropping to the glowing red screen. In the world of high finance, a declined card was not just an inconvenience. It was a massive red flag that signaled hidden insolvency. Jason forced a loud laugh, heavily clapping one of the investors on the shoulder. He loudly blamed the bank, claiming that their fraud department was always freezing his accounts because he traveled so much and made such massive, unpredictable purchases. It was a desperate and transparent excuse. His hands were shaking slightly as he reached back into his designer wallet and pulled out a second platinum card. This one was tied to a completely different corporate account, the one they used for heavy business expenses. He handed it over to the bartender with a tight, strained smile. The bartender swiped the second card. The machine beeped aggressively. The red screen flashed again immediately. Declined. The silence at the bar was suddenly deafening. Even Richard stopped smiling, his face hardening as he stared furiously at his son. The investors exchanged a brief, highly uncomfortable look. Jason felt a cold drop of sweat slide down his neck, soaking into his expensive silk collar. His mind raced in absolute panic. This was mathematically impossible. He snatched both cards back from the bartender, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He muttered a quick apology to the group, claiming his incompetent wife must have messed up a wire transfer that morning. He promised to clear it up in 2 minutes and practically sprinted away from the bar, pushing past the birthday party guests to reach the quiet hallway near the restrooms. Once he was completely alone, Jason pulled out his phone and dialed my number. His breathing was heavy, fueled by sheer panic and rising fury. The call went straight to voicemail. He gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. When the beep sounded, he unleashed a barrage of toxic rage. He screamed into the receiver, demanding to know what I had done to the accounts. He ordered me to fix the glitch immediately, threatening to make my life a living nightmare if he had to go back to that bar empty-handed. Miles away, I was cruising down the interstate with the windows slightly cracked, enjoying the fresh autumn breeze. My phone screen lit up on the dashboard, displaying a notification for a new voicemail from Jason. I glanced at the screen, seeing the audio transcription start to populate with his angry, frantic words. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I did not feel the need to listen to his familiar verbal abuse. I simply reached out, tapped the screen, and hit delete. The message vanished into the digital void. I kept my eyes focused on the road ahead. I had an appointment with my real estate attorney, and I was not going to be late. I pulled my SUV into the underground parking garage of a sleek glass building in downtown Chicago. The transition from the leafy suburban country club to the cold and efficient architecture of the financial district perfectly mirrored my own internal shift. I parked in a visitor spot, grabbed my tote bag, and took the elevator up to the 14th floor. The polished brass doors slid open to reveal the quiet, imposing reception area of Harrison and Associates, the premier real estate law firm in the city. I bypassed the plush waiting area entirely. The receptionist offered a polite nod and buzzed me straight through to the corner office. My real estate attorney Gregory was already waiting for me at his massive oak desk. A thick stack of legal documents was neatly arranged on his leather blotting pad, right next to a heavy silver pen. Gregory stood up, offered a firm handshake, and gestured for me to take a seat. He was a man of few words, which was exactly why I hired him. He did not ask about my emotional state or the sudden nature of the sale. He only cared about the ironclad legality of the transaction we were about to execute. As I sat down in the deep leather chair, I looked at the top document. The address of our $2 million suburban estate was printed boldly across the top of the page. Looking at those typed numbers brought a wave of absolute clarity and a deep sense of vindication. For the entirety of our marriage, Jason and his father had spun a massive, elaborate lie about that house. They told everyone at the country club, every neighbor, and every extended family member that Richard had graciously purchased the sprawling 5-bedroom property as a generous wedding gift for his only son. Richard loved to stand in our marble foyer during holiday cocktail parties, swirling a glass of expensive wine, eagerly accepting endless compliments on his supposed immense generosity. Jason strutted around the manicured lawns, acting like the lord of the manor, fully believing he was the sole heir to a vast real estate fortune. They used that house as the ultimate proof of their superior social standing. They used it to make me feel like a charity case who was lucky to have a roof over my head. But the truth was a completely different story. The truth was something only Gregory and I knew. When Jason and I were first engaged, Richard was already quietly drowning in massive debt. His prestigious investment firm was nothing more than a failing facade. He did not have $2 million to buy a house. He did not even have $20,000 to spare. But I did. Before we got married, I received a substantial inheritance from my late grandfather, a hard-working man who spent his life building a successful logistics company. My grandfather taught me the immense value of protecting my assets. Combined with my professional training as a forensic accountant, I knew exactly how to handle the situation. I never transferred a single dime of my inheritance into a joint family account. Instead, I quietly established a single-member limited liability company called Apex Holdings. I was the sole owner and managing member of that entity. I used Apex Holdings to purchase the estate entirely in cash. Jason was so incredibly lazy and so completely trusting of his father's fake wealth that he never once asked to see the closing documents. Richard, desperate to keep up his billionaire appearances, happily took the credit for the purchase and told Jason that the family lawyers had handled all the complex paperwork. Jason simply assumed his name was on the deed alongside his father's. He never bothered to check the county tax records. He never realized that he was essentially just a long-term guest, living in a house owned by a corporate entity that I completely controlled. My signature was the only one that legally mattered. And today, I was using that signature to pull the roof right off over their heads. Gregory tapped the silver pen against the documents and cleared his throat. He confirmed that the institutional buyer was fully funded and ready to close the transaction immediately. Because the property was owned exclusively by my corporate entity, the sale did not require any spousal consent notification or signature from Jason. We were bypassing the traditional real estate market entirely. I had negotiated a lightning-fast cash sale with a major corporate holding firm that specialized in acquiring luxury properties. The price was slightly below market value, but I did not care about maximizing profit. I cared about maximizing the speed of the execution. I picked up the silver pen. The metal felt cold and heavy in my hand. I looked at the line requiring the signature of the authorized managing member. I thought about the way Jason had just thrown my name card across the room. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name with absolute precision, pressing hard enough to leave a permanent indentation on the pages beneath. I slid the heavy silver pen across the thick stack of legal papers, finalizing the last signature required to sever my ties to that house completely. Gregory gathered the documents, his face a mask of professional stoicism. He checked every initial, every date, and every notarized seal to ensure the transaction was absolutely bulletproof. There was no room for error when dealing with high-speed corporate real estate acquisitions. The buyer on the other side of this deal was not a young family looking for a starter home with a white picket fence. It was a massive institutional investment fund. They did not care about the custom drapery or the expensive landscaping Jason loved to brag about to his friends. They only cared about the square footage, the zip code, and the property margins. Selling to a corporate holding firm meant sacrificing a small percentage of the overall market value, but it afforded me the one thing I needed more than anything else right now: absolute speed. There were no open houses for Jason to notice. There were no nosy appraisers walking through our living room taking photos of our furniture. There was no waiting 30 to 60 days for a traditional bank to approve a mortgage. It was a brutal, highly efficient cash buyout negotiated completely behind closed doors over the span of 72 hours. The investment fund had already run their comprehensive title checks. They knew Apex Holdings owned the property free and clear, and they were ready to wire the funds the second my ink dried on the quitclaim deed. Gregory picked up his desk phone and dialed his escrow officer. He spoke in low, measured tones, confirming that the signed deed was currently being scanned and securely transmitted to the buyer's legal team. I sat back in the deep leather chair, watching the second hand on the large wall clock tick away. My phone rested on the edge of the desk, its screen dark and silent. Jason was probably still frantically dialing my number, raging at my voicemail, because his precious platinum cards were declining at the country club bar. While he was throwing a pathetic tantrum over a $500 bottle of champagne, I was quietly moving millions of dollars right under his nose. A few minutes passed in heavy, expectant silence. Then Gregory's computer chimed with an incoming secure message. At the exact same moment, the screen of my phone lit up with a high-priority banking alert. I picked it up and unlocked the screen. The notification was from my private wealth management application. A wire transfer in the amount of $2,100,000 had successfully cleared. The funds did not sit in a standard domestic account where a judge could easily freeze them during a messy divorce proceeding. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly how to make money legally disappear. The cash was instantly routed away from domestic banking systems and deposited directly into a secure private offshore trust I had established months ago. I structured the trust very carefully as an irrevocable asset protection vehicle. By the time Jason inevitably hired a bulldog divorce attorney to come after my money, they would hit an impenetrable legal wall. The funds were completely out of the jurisdiction of local courts and entirely inaccessible to anyone but me and my daughter Lily. The inheritance from my grandfather was finally safe cleansed of the toxic environment Jason and Richard had created. Gregory folded his hands on the massive oak desk and gave me a rare, tight smile. He announced that the transaction was officially complete and the title had been formally transferred. The massive suburban estate, the grand symbol of Richard's fake billionaire status, no longer belonged to me. More importantly, it no longer belonged to them. It was now the legal property of a faceless, ruthless corporate entity that operated with zero emotion and strict liability protocols. The investment fund had a standard operating procedure for newly acquired vacant properties. They moved incredibly fast to secure their assets against squatters or disgruntled former tenants. Within the hour, their local property management team would be dispatched to the address. I thanked Gregory for his flawless execution, stood up, and shook his hand firmly. I walked out of the law firm feeling lighter than I had in years. The heavy burden of that house and the suffocating lies attached to it were permanently gone. But my work for the day was not quite finished. I stepped into the elevator, pulled out my phone again, and prepared to cut the final cords keeping that house alive. The elevator doors glided shut, sealing me inside the quiet metal box as I descended to the parking garage. I leaned against the mirrored back wall and unlocked my phone. The screen cast a bright light in the dim space. I opened the smart home application that controlled every electronic system in the house we had lived in for 5 years. Because I had overseen the entire installation process and paid for the upgrades, the master administrator account was securely registered under my personal email address. When you sell a property to an institutional buyer, the handover protocol is completely different from a normal family transaction. There is no friendly exchange of brass keys on the front porch. The corporate holding firm operates with ruthless digital efficiency. As soon as Gregory confirmed the wire transfer, the buyer's automated system sent a direct request to my smart home dashboard to transfer ownership of the security grid. I tapped the accept button without a single second of hesitation. Instantly, the user interface on my screen shifted. I watched the live activity log as the new property management company took remote control of the front door. The electronic deadbolt which Jason loved to show off to his friends was wiped completely clean. The digital access codes assigned to Jason, Richard, and even Naomi were permanently deleted from the system matrix. The corporate managers generated a new, highly encrypted alphanumeric code for their own security personnel. In a matter of seconds, the sprawling $2 million estate was completely sealed off. No one was getting through that solid oak front door without a crowbar and a willingness to commit a serious federal crime. But locking them out was only the first step. I wanted them to understand the absolute totality of their situation. I closed the security app and opened the portal for the local electric company. During our marriage, Jason always told people that paying the utility bills was beneath him. He claimed his financial portfolio was too complex to bother with mundane monthly expenses. The truth, as always, was much more pathetic. Jason's credit score was so heavily damaged from his secret fraudulent loans that he could not even get a basic electrical account approved without paying a massive security deposit. So, like everything else in our lives, the accounts were placed entirely in my name. I was the legally responsible party for the power, the water, the gas, and the high-speed internet. I navigated to the service cancellation page. The system asked for a termination date. I selected the option for immediate shutoff. A warning message popped up advising that a sudden cancellation could take up to an hour to process. I confirmed the selection. I did the exact same thing for the natural gas provider, ensuring the house would quickly lose its heat on this crisp autumn afternoon. Finally, I opened the application for our premium internet service provider. Jason relied on that high-speed connection for his daily trading simulations, which he pretended were real investments. I hit the terminate button. By the time the elevator reached the basement level and the doors slid open, the digital guillotine had officially fallen. I walked across the concrete floor of the parking garage toward my car, picturing the sequence of events unfolding miles away at the suburban estate. The heavy hum of the central air conditioning unit would slowly grind to a halt. The massive dual-door refrigerator in the custom kitchen would stop running. The carefully programmed landscape lighting that illuminated the manicured front lawn would never turn on tonight. The high-definition security cameras mounted over the garage would go blind. The house was no longer a welcoming beacon of fake wealth. It was now a dark, cold, locked fortress owned by a faceless corporation. I got back into my SUV and started the engine. The dashboard clock read 4 in the afternoon. The birthday party at the country club was scheduled to wrap up in about an hour. Jason and Richard would be saying their final goodbyes to the New York investors, likely offering hollow apologies for the embarrassing credit card declines at the bar. They would pack Lily into Jason's luxury sedan and drive back to the neighborhood completely unaware that they no longer had a home to return to. They thought they were the masters of the universe, untouchable and superior. But I had just systematically dismantled their entire existence from the front seat of my car. The financial accounts were frozen, the real estate was sold, the utilities were dead. I pulled out of the parking garage and merged into the late afternoon city traffic. It was time to retrieve my daughter and set the stage for the final act of this tragedy to play out. Are you dealing with an unbearable situation right now? Tell me your story in the comments. Back inside the Oak Brook Country Club, the extravagant birthday party was slowly beginning to wind down. The hired entertainment was packing up their equipment in the corner, and the catering staff was quietly clearing away the remnants of the gourmet dessert bar. At the polished mahogany bar, Richard was working overtime to keep his carefully constructed facade from completely shattering. Jason had still not returned from his frantic dash out of the room, leaving Richard entirely alone to entertain the three highly influential New York investors. Richard was a seasoned master of manipulation, and he smoothly steered the conversation away from his son's embarrassing and public credit card declines. He laughed heartily, waving his hand in the air with practiced ease, telling the investors that young executives with too much capital often forget to notify their fraud departments before a busy weekend. The investors offered polite, tight-lipped smiles in return, but the atmosphere around the bar had definitively shifted. The golden, untouchable aura of the billionaire patriarch was beginning to heavily tarnish right in front of their eyes. Just as Richard was signaling the bartender to pour another round of expensive drinks, to smooth over the awkward tension, his cell phone vibrated violently against his chest. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored Tom Ford suit, fully intending to silence the device and maintain his focus on the guests. But when he casually glanced down at the glowing screen, his smug expression vanished instantly. The caller identification displayed the direct emergency line for his senior wealth manager at Chase Bank. This was not a number that ever called on a Saturday afternoon, unless something absolutely catastrophic had occurred. Richard forced a strained, unnatural smile, excused himself to the investors, and quickly stepped away from the bar. He walked briskly toward a quiet, dimly lit alcove near the grand staircase, mistakenly believing he was safely out of earshot and out of sight. He was not. Jamal was standing just a few yards away holding a glass of sparkling water, waiting for his wife Naomi to return from the restroom. In his professional life as a senior bank risk analyst, Jamal was highly trained to detect the subtle physical indicators of financial ruin. He spent his days evaluating corporate stability and looking for the exact moment a company executive realized their business was going under. Jamal watched Richard press the phone to his ear. He saw the exact second the color completely drained from Richard's face. It was a rapid, horrifying physical transformation. The proud, arrogant posture crumbled in an instant. Richard's broad shoulders slumped forward, and his free hand gripped the marble railing of the staircase so tightly that his knuckles turned stark white. On the other end of the line, the wealth manager was delivering a fatal blow to the fake empire. The banker coldly informed Richard that the massive surety bond, the foundational collateral that served as the absolute backbone for Richard's entire investment firm, had been abruptly frozen. The banker explained that the primary guarantor on the master account had just initiated a total lockdown across all platforms, citing suspected unauthorized use and identity fraud. Richard felt all the air leave his lungs. He sputtered in disbelief, demanding the bank lift the freeze immediately. He hissed into the phone, claiming he was the chief executive officer and demanding instant access to his capital. The banker simply replied that they had a strict legal obligation to comply with federal regulations when a primary guarantor flagged an account, and that Richard currently had zero access to any liquid funds whatsoever. The call abruptly disconnected, leaving Richard listening to dead air. Jamal watched Richard slowly lower the phone from his ear. Richard looked physically ill, like a man who had just been diagnosed with a terminal disease. Jamal's analytical mind immediately started connecting the scattered dots. He thought about Jason desperately swiping 2 different platinum cards at the bar just minutes ago and getting denied. He thought about the frantic, angry look on Jason's face when he sprinted out of the ballroom. Now he was watching the supposed billionaire patriarch hyperventilating in a country club alcove. Jamal knew exactly how corporate banking systems operated. A temporary security glitch on a single credit card was an isolated incident. But an isolated incident combined with a panicked emergency call from a wealth manager meant something entirely different. This was a systemic liquidity crisis. Jamal narrowed his eyes, observing Richard frantically trying to dial another number, his hands shaking so violently that he dropped his expensive phone directly onto the plush carpet. Jamal felt a cold, heavy knot form in his stomach. He did not know the exact details of the fraud yet, but he knew with absolute certainty that Richard's empire was a complete illusion. There was no vast wealth. There was no massive real estate portfolio. They were completely broke, and a massive financial collapse was unfolding in real time, right in front of him. Naomi walked out of the restroom completely oblivious to the disaster, smiling brightly as she adjusted her designer jewelry. Jamal looked at his wife, then back to the hyperventilating Richard. The party was officially over, and Jamal knew the incoming fallout was going to be absolutely devastating. I sat in the driver's seat of my SUV parked safely in the deep shadows of the cul-de-sac just 3 houses down from the property. The sun had completely dipped below the horizon, leaving the upscale suburban neighborhood bathed in the cool glow of street lamps. Every house on the block was lit up with warm, inviting lights except for one. The massive $2 million estate that used to be my prison was completely pitch black. The expensive landscape lighting was dead. The carriage lamps flanking the garage were dark. The corporate property management team had moved with terrifying efficiency. I watched them arrive an hour earlier in a white van, change the physical locks on the side doors, stack the boxes on the porch, and post the legal notices before vanishing into the night. Now I simply waited in the silence of my car for the guests of honor to arrive. At exactly 6:15, the sleek headlights of 2 luxury vehicles pierced the darkness of the street. Jason's black sedan pulled into the sprawling driveway, first immediately followed by Jamal's car. I watched through my tinted windshield as the doors opened. The crisp autumn air carried the faint sound of their voices. Jason stepped out first, slamming his door with unnecessary force. Even from a distance, I could see the rigid tension in his shoulders. The humiliation at the country club bar had clearly taken its toll. Richard emerged from the passenger side, moving slowly, looking like a hollow shell of the arrogant patriarch who had strutted into the ballroom just a few hours ago. Naomi and Jamal climbed out of the second car. Jamal was holding Lily's hand, gently keeping her close to him while Naomi complained loudly about the freezing temperature. Jason marched up the slate walkway toward the front entrance, completely oblivious to the signs of his impending ruin. He was still desperately clinging to the illusion that he was in control. He pulled out his phone, likely expecting the front porch lights to automatically illuminate as he approached a smart home feature I had personally programmed. When the house remained completely dark, he muttered a string of angry curses, loudly blaming me for forgetting to pay the electric bill. He walked up the stone steps to the massive oak front door and pressed his finger against the illuminated keypad. Nothing happened. The screen was completely dead. There was no reassuring beep and no green light. Jason aggressively jabbed his thumb into the glass panel again and again. He pulled up the security application on his phone, only to find a bold error message stating his account access had been permanently revoked by the system administrator. While Jason was furiously hitting the dead keypad, Naomi shined the flashlight from her cell phone across the wide covered porch. The bright white beam cut through the darkness and landed on a massive pile of cheap brown cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly near the bay windows. Naomi let out a sharp gasp, calling for her brother. Jason and Richard abandoned the door and walked over to the pile. The property management team had been incredibly thorough. Inside those flimsy boxes were the items Jason and Richard valued most in the entire world. Richard's collection of vintage Rolex watches, which he loved to aggressively display during business meetings, were tossed inside next to his expensive imported cigars. Jason's custom-fitted golf clubs, his tailored designer suits, and his imported leather shoes were piled up like worthless donations outside a thrift store. Jason stared at the boxes in absolute disbelief. His brain simply could not process the image of his precious luxury items sitting in the dirt. Richard stumbled backward, clutching his chest as he recognized his custom suits crumpled in the cardboard. It was the ultimate visual representation of their actual worth. But the final crushing blow was waiting for them right in the center of the front door. taped securely to the custom wood at eye level was a bright, stark white piece of legal paper. Jason snatched it off the door, holding his phone flashlight up to illuminate the text. Even from my car, I could see Jason's hands begin to violently shake as he read the bold black lettering. It was an official notice of trespass from the legal department of Apex Holdings. It clearly stated that the property was now under the exclusive ownership of a corporate entity, and any attempt to enter the premises would be prosecuted to the absolute fullest extent of the law. There was no mention of my name. There was no mention of a family dispute. It was cold corporate and entirely absolute. Jason dropped the paper onto the porch. He looked up at the dark, silent house, finally realizing that the warm, luxurious life he had stolen was permanently gone. He was locked out in the cold, and I was just getting started. Jason stared at the legal notice fluttering in the cold evening breeze, his mind frantically trying to process the impossible information written in black and white. For a long moment, the only sound on the dark porch was the rustling of the paper. Then Jason finally snapped. He crumpled the notice in his fist and let out a furious roar that echoed down the quiet suburban street. He spun around, his face contorted in absolute rage, and kicked one of the cardboard boxes as hard as he could. The flimsy cardboard split open, sending his expensive imported leather shoes and several custom-tailored dress shirts spilling onto the cold concrete. He screamed my name into the darkness, completely unhinged. He shouted that I had lost my mind, that I had illegally changed the locks on his house while he was trying to entertain important investors. He paced back and forth across the porch like a trapped animal, aggressively running his hands through his hair. He turned to his father, his eyes wide and frantic, demanding to know how I could possibly have bypassed the smart home security protocols. Jason was so deeply entrenched in his own lies that he genuinely believed he was the victim of a deranged, hysterical wife who was throwing a petty tantrum over a seating arrangement. Richard leaned heavily against a stone pillar, still visibly shaken by the devastating phone call he had received at the country club. The color had not yet returned to his face, but his innate arrogance quickly flared back to life to mask his fear. He pointed a trembling finger at the dead electronic keypad on the door. He demanded that Jason stop acting like a child and immediately call the local police department. Richard puffed out his chest, declaring that he had personally put down $500,000 for the down payment on this estate, and that no ungrateful daughter-in-law was going to lock him out of his own property. He insisted the police would arrive, arrest me for domestic disturbance and illegal eviction, and have the door open in 5 minutes. Naomi, who was shivering in her thin designer cocktail dress, eagerly jumped onto the bandwagon of righteous indignation. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest and loudly proclaimed that she had always known I was unstable. She shrieked about my absolute audacity, claiming that locking an elderly man and a successful executive out in the freezing cold was bordering on criminal abuse. She pulled out her own phone and started furiously typing a message into their extended family group chat, eager to be the first to broadcast my supposed mental breakdown to all their relatives. They were a perfect echo chamber of entitlement, completely unified in their belief that they held the moral and legal high ground. They stood there on the dark porch, a chorus of angry, wealthy victims, demanding immediate justice for a crime that had not actually occurred. From the safety of my car parked down the street, I watched the chaotic scene unfold like a silent movie. I could not hear every single word they said, but their aggressive body language told the entire story. I saw Jason pacing. I saw Richard pointing furiously at the door. I saw Naomi waving her phone around. They were so predictable. They always relied on intimidation and the illusion of power to force their way through any conflict. They thought a phone call to the authorities would instantly restore order and put me back in my place. They were about to learn a very harsh lesson about how the real world actually operates when the protective shield of fake wealth is stripped away. Jamal was the only one not participating in the uproar. He stood near the bottom of the porch steps, keeping a protective arm around Lily, shielding her from Jason's violent outburst. He watched his wife screaming at the dark house. He watched his father-in-law making empty threats. He watched his brother-in-law kicking boxes of expensive clothes. Jamal's sharp, analytical mind was working in overdrive processing the timeline of the evening. He remembered the declined credit cards. He remembered Richard's absolute panic at the country club. And now he was looking at a legally executed lockout that clearly required significant corporate coordination. Jamal knew that angry wives might change a deadbolt, but they do not typically generate professional notices from corporate holding firms. He realized long before anyone else on that porch that they were not dealing with a simple domestic dispute. They were dealing with a highly calculated, legally binding demolition. Jason pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering aggressively over the keypad. He looked at Richard, waiting for the final confirmation. Richard gave a sharp, definitive nod. Jason dialed 911. The call connected, and Jason immediately launched into his practiced routine using his most authoritative executive voice. He told the dispatcher that his unstable wife had illegally locked him out of his primary residence, and he requested an officer be dispatched immediately to assist him in regaining entry. He hung up the phone with a smug, triumphant look, confidently telling the family that the police were on their way to handle the situation. They all stood slightly taller, waiting for the flashing lights to arrive and validate their manufactured outrage. Jason slid his phone back into his pocket with a smug, self-satisfied grin. He turned to his father and proudly announced that dispatch was sending a patrol car right away. He puffed out his chest, bragging to Naomi that the police would force the door open, and he would personally ensure I spent the night in a holding cell for domestic harassment. They all nodded in agreement, feeding off each other's delusions. But while they were busy celebrating their imaginary victory, Jamal quietly separated himself from the group. He walked up the stone steps, bent down, and picked up the crumpled legal notice Jason had thrown onto the cold concrete. Jamal smoothed out the wrinkled paper against his thigh. He was a man who spent 50 hours a week analyzing corporate risk, verifying asset collateral, and reading the fine print that other people ignored. He brought the paper close to his face, using the ambient light from the street lamps to read the text. He did not just see a piece of paper. He saw a legally binding corporate mandate. He noticed the high-level legal jargon, the specific citation of property statutes, and the complete absence of my name. It did not read like a restraining order or a petty spouse's revenge note. It read like an absolute transfer of commercial assets. From the dark interior of my SUV down the street, I watched the blue light from Jamal's smartphone illuminate his face. I smiled. Jamal was finally doing what Jason and Richard had been too arrogant and too lazy to do for 5 entire years. He was checking the actual facts. Jamal navigated directly to the public website for the county tax assessor. It is a standard tool for anyone in the banking industry. You simply type in a residential address, and the database instantly reveals the legal owner, the tax history, and the recorded deed transfers. Jamal typed in the address of the sprawling suburban estate. The loading wheel spun for a brief moment before the public records populated on his screen. His eyes scanned the digital document, tracking the history of the property. He saw the initial purchase record from years ago. He saw that it was bought entirely in cash, with zero mortgage recorded. Most importantly, he saw the registered owner. It was not Jason. It was not Richard. The property was exclusively registered to Apex Holdings, LLC. He scrolled down further and saw the immediate transfer of the deed that had been executed just hours ago to a massive corporate investment fund. The truth hit Jamal like a physical blow. He looked up from his screen and stared at Richard. He remembered all the lavish holiday dinners where Richard bragged about writing a massive $500,000 check for the down payment. He remembered Jason acting like a real estate mogul. It was all a complete fabrication. They were living in a house owned by a corporate entity, and they had absolutely no legal rights to the property whatsoever. Jason was still pacing near the bay windows, kicking at the dirt and muttering about how he was going to destroy me in divorce court. He actually bent down and picked up a heavy landscaping rock, weighing it in his hand, glaring at the glass window of the living room. He loudly declared that he did not have time to wait for the police and that he was just going to smash the glass and unlock the front door from the inside. Jamal stepped forward immediately, his voice sharp and authoritative, cutting through Jason's furious rant. He ordered Jason to drop the rock right now. Jason spun around, surprised by the commanding tone of his brother-in-law. He aggressively asked Jamal what his problem was, reiterating that this was his house and he could break a window if he wanted to. Jamal shook his head slowly. He held up his phone, the screen glowing brightly in the dark. He looked Jason dead in the eye and delivered the absolute reality check. He told Jason that the house did not belong to him. He read the public tax record out loud, stating clearly that the property was legally owned by Apex Holdings LLC and had just been sold to an institutional buyer. He looked at Richard and explicitly stated that neither of their names had ever been on the deed. Jason froze, the heavy rock still clutched in his hand. Naomi stopped shivering and stared at her husband in confusion. Richard opened his mouth to argue, to spin another lie, but Jamal did not give him the chance. Jamal pointed at the dark house and laid out the legal reality. He warned them that this was no longer a domestic dispute over a changed lock. He told Jason that if he threw that rock and broke that window, he was not breaking into his own home. He would be committing a felony breaking and entering offense on a commercially owned property. Jamal lowered his voice, delivering the final devastating blow. He reminded Jason that he had just called the police himself. When those officers arrived, they were not coming to help a locked-out homeowner. They were coming to arrest a group of trespassers standing on private corporate property. The rock slipped from Jason's hand and hit the concrete with a dull thud. The illusion of ownership completely vanished into the cold night air. The heavy silence that followed Jamal's revelation was abruptly shattered by the wail of approaching sirens. Red and blue lights bounced off the manicured trees and the dark brick exterior of the corporate-owned estate. Jason instantly straightened his posture, a sickeningly smug grin returning to his face. He mistakenly assumed the local police department had prioritized his call and dispatched a unit in record time to cater to his demands. He adjusted the lapels of his suit jacket and marched down the stone steps, fully prepared to play the role of the aggrieved wealthy homeowner who needed the authorities to discipline his hysterical wife. But the vehicles that pulled to a stop at the end of the driveway were not the standard neighborhood patrol. A marked police cruiser parked at an angle, blocking the driveway entirely. Right behind it, a dark gray unmarked sedan rolled to a quiet stop. Two uniformed officers stepped out of the cruiser, their expressions stern and strictly professional. From the unmarked sedan emerged a woman in a sharp navy business suit, a silver badge hanging prominently from a lanyard around her neck. This was not a response to a simple domestic dispute. Jason hurried toward them, pointing an accusatory finger back at the dark house. He loudly demanded the officers break down the front door immediately. He started ranting about how I had lost my mind, stolen his keys, and locked his elderly father out in the cold. He demanded they put out an alert to find me and arrest me for theft and child endangerment. The lead officer did not even look at the house. He held up a firm gloved hand, stopping Jason dead in his tracks. He asked Jason to confirm his full legal name and date of birth. Jason blinked, visibly confused by the lack of immediate obedience, but he barked out his information. The officer nodded to the woman in the suit. She stepped forward, ignoring Jason entirely, and locked her eyes on Jamal, who was standing quietly near the edge of the lawn with his arm wrapped protectively around Lily. The woman introduced herself as an investigator with the Department of Child and Family Services. The words hung in the freezing air, heavier than any brick Jason could have thrown. Richard stumbled down the steps, demanding to know what Child Protective Services was doing on his property, instinctively trying to throw his imaginary weight around. The investigator completely ignored Richard. She opened a thick manila folder and pulled out a document stamped with the red seal of the county family court. She looked directly at Jason and informed him that an emergency protective order had been signed by a judge just 3 hours ago. She stated clearly that I had been granted full, immediate, and exclusive emergency custody of Lily. Jason exploded. He screamed that I was a liar and a kidnapper, insisting I had no grounds to take his daughter away from him. The investigator remained completely unfazed by his violent outburst. She calmly explained that the judge did not require my verbal testimony because he had already seen the high-definition video evidence. She detailed the hidden camera footage I had submitted that very morning to the court. The footage clearly showed Jason in a drunken, unprovoked rage hurling heavy glass liquor bottles across the living room, shattering them against the wall just inches away from where Lily was sitting in her playpen. All the blood drained from Jason's face. His jaw went slack. He thought that terrible incident was a secret. He thought I was too terrified and submissive to ever document his escalating violence. He looked back at his father, but Richard was completely speechless, staring blankly at the ground. Jason took a desperate step toward Jamal and Lily, yelling that the video was completely fake. The lead police officer instantly stepped between them, resting his hand firmly on his duty belt. His voice was cold and commanding. He informed Jason that the protective order legally mandated he remain 500 feet away from Lily at all times. The officer warned him that taking one more step would result in his immediate physical arrest for violating a direct court mandate. Jamal did not wait for another warning. He acted with the calm, decisive clarity of a man who recognized a sinking ship. He knelt down to my daughter's eye level, offering her a warm, reassuring smile. He told Lily that she was going to take a safe special car ride to meet her mom and get that secret birthday present. Lily smiled brightly, completely trusting her uncle. Jamal stood up and gently handed Lily over to the investigator, placing her safely behind the solid wall of uniformed police officers. From the dark interior of my SUV parked down the street, I watched the investigator strap Lily securely into the back seat of the unmarked sedan. The police cruiser backed out, clearing the way. I watched the taillights fade down the road, knowing they were heading to the safe precinct where I was waiting. I watched Jason fall to his knees on the freezing concrete driveway, clutching his head in his hands. In the span of a few hours, he had lost his credit cards, his $2 million home, and now his daughter. The total isolation was finally complete. I shifted my SUV into drive and eased my foot onto the gas pedal. I did not turn on my headlights until I was a full block away from the dark, corporate-owned estate. I followed the faint red glow of the police taillights in the distance, navigating the winding suburban streets with a profound sense of absolute peace. The heavy, suffocating weight that had rested on my chest for the past 5 years was completely gone. I was finally free. But before I could fully process the relief of knowing Lily was safe on her way to the precinct, the digital display on my dashboard lit up with an incoming call. The name Jason flashed across the screen in bright, aggressive letters. My first instinct was to simply press the ignore button and let his frantic energy dissolve into the digital void of my voicemail. I had already taken his money, his house, and his victim. There was technically nothing left to say to him. But as the phone continued to ring, vibrating violently against the center console, a cold, calculating urge washed over me. I wanted him to hear my voice. I wanted him to understand that this was not a manic episode or a temporary emotional breakdown. This was a surgically planned execution. I reached out and tapped the green accept button on the touchscreen. I did not say hello. I just let the silence stretch across the cellular connection. Jason did not need a greeting. The second the line opened, he unleashed a torrent of pure, unadulterated rage. His voice was completely hoarse, cracking under the strain of his own screaming. He demanded to know where I was hiding. He threatened to have me arrested for kidnapping, completely ignoring the fact that a judge in Child Protective Services had just legally removed his daughter from a highly dangerous environment. When I refused to take the bait and remained absolutely silent, his anger pivoted away from Lily and aimed directly at the one thing he actually cared about: his money, his pride, and his precious reputation. He screamed that I had made the biggest mistake of my miserable working-class life. He boasted that he was going to hire the most vicious, expensive divorce attorneys in the entire city of Chicago. He promised to drag me through the court system for a decade if he had to. He swore he would legally strip me of every single asset I owned, drain my bank accounts, and leave me absolutely penniless on the street. He yelled that he was a wealthy executive, and I was just a nobody, and that by the time his lawyers were done with me, I would be begging him to take me back. I listened to his frantic, hyperventilating threats while keeping my eyes focused on the empty road ahead. His words were so incredibly hollow. He was threatening to crush me with a financial empire that literally did not exist. He was promising to hire $500 an hour lawyers when he could not even buy a glass of champagne at the country club. He was a small, pathetic man standing in the freezing cold on a driveway he did not own, screaming at the woman who controlled his entire universe. I let him yell until his voice gave out and his words devolved into heavy, ragged panting. When I was absolutely sure he was finished, I finally spoke. My voice was completely steady, devoid of any anger, sadness, or fear. It was the icy, detached tone of a forensic auditor delivering a final damning report. I told Jason that I welcomed the divorce. I told him he could hire whatever lawyers he wanted to try and come after my assets. But then I lowered my voice, ensuring every single syllable was razor sharp and perfectly clear. I told him that before he wasted his time filing any lawsuits against me, he had a much more urgent family matter to attend to. I said, before you sue me, you might want to turn around and ask your father what collateral he used to secure that $3 million commercial loan from Chase Bank last year. I did not wait for his response. I did not wait for his confusion to turn into blind panic. I reached forward and tapped the red button on the dashboard, instantly severing the connection. The cabin of my SUV was immediately plunged back into a beautiful, heavy silence. I pulled over to the side of the road, opened my phone settings, and permanently blocked his number. The trap was now fully sprung. Jason and Richard were about to have a devastating conversation on that dark driveway, and the final illusion holding their toxic family together was about to permanently shatter. I merged back onto the road and headed toward the precinct to hug my daughter. The line went completely dead. Jason stood frozen on the icy concrete of the driveway, his cell phone still pressed tightly against his ear. The absolute silence of the disconnected call rang louder in his head than any of my previous threats. Slowly, he lowered the phone. His breathing was shallow and erratic. A cold, suffocating dread began to pool in the pit of his stomach, replacing the fiery rage he felt just moments before. My final words echoed relentlessly. Jason turned his head slowly. A few yards away, Richard was leaning heavily against Jason's sedan. The older man was shivering violently in the biting autumn wind. Without the backdrop of a luxury home or a high-end country club, Richard looked incredibly small, frail, and remarkably pathetic. The illusion of the untouchable billionaire patriarch had been entirely stripped away by the harsh reality of the dark locked property behind them. Jason took a tentative step toward his father. Then he took another, his pace quickening until he was standing just inches away from the man he had idolized his entire life. Jason stared directly into Richard's eyes, searching for the familiar arrogance, the unshakable confidence that had always anchored their family. It was completely gone. In its place was stark, undeniable terror. Jason's voice trembled when he finally spoke, barely louder than a whisper. He asked his father what I was talking about. He demanded to know what happened with the Chase Bank loan last year. Richard instinctively tried to rely on his classic playbook of deflection and gaslighting. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project authority. He aggressively waved his hand and told Jason to stop listening to the hysterical ramblings of a bitter wife. Richard insisted that corporate banking was far too complex for me to understand, and that everything was perfectly under control. But Jason was no longer blinded by the familial loyalty that had kept him compliant for so long. The devastating events of the evening were finally snapping into a clear, horrifying picture. The platinum credit cards being declined at the bar, the panicked phone call from the wealth manager about a frozen surety bond, the corporate lockout at the house, and now my chillingly specific warning about a specific commercial loan. Jason suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Richard by the lapels of his expensive Tom Ford suit. He slammed his father back against the cold metal of the sedan. Jason screamed into Richard's face, his voice cracking with pure panic. He demanded the absolute truth. He asked where the money was coming from and what exactly they had signed last November when Richard claimed he was just restructuring the family portfolio for tax purposes. The physical impact and the sheer terror in his son's eyes finally broke the last remaining piece of Richard's facade. The older man physically collapsed inward, his shoulders sagging, his eyes dropping to the concrete. The devastating backstory poured out of him in a rushed, pathetic confession. Richard admitted that his prestigious investment firm had not just experienced a minor market downturn, it had completely and utterly failed. 3 years ago, the firm went completely bankrupt. Every single massive account had been liquidated to cover their mounting legal debts. The vast fortune Jason thought he was destined to inherit simply did not exist. For 36 straight months, they had been living entirely on fumes and desperate lies. The country club, dues, the luxury car leases, the designer clothes, and the lavish parties were all funded by a highly illegal, unsustainable house of cards. Richard confessed he was terrified of losing his status among Chicago's elite. Jason stepped back, his hands dropping to his sides, looking at his father as if he were staring at a complete stranger. The reality was crushing. He was not a wealthy heir. He was the son of a broke, desperate con artist. But then the darkest realization of all hit Jason like a freight train. If Richard's credit was completely destroyed by bankruptcy, how did they secure the loan? Jason asked the question out loud, his voice perfectly flat with horror. Richard could not even look his son in the eye. He confessed the final unforgivable crime. He reminded Jason that they needed a primary guarantor with an immaculate financial history. Richard admitted he had convinced Jason to forge my signature and illegally use my social security number to collateralize the entire fraudulent empire. They had committed federal wire fraud. Jason realized in that exact moment that he was not just facing a messy divorce or an embarrassing financial setback. Because of his blind loyalty to a father who cared only about appearances, Jason was going to federal prison. The cold wind howled around them, sealing their devastating fate in the absolute darkness. Jason stared at his father, the freezing wind whipping around them as the specific memory of that crisp November night rushed back with sickening clarity. He remembered sitting in his father's oak-paneled study, drinking expensive bourbon that they could not actually afford. Richard had slid a massive stack of complex commercial loan applications across the polished leather desk. They were desperate. The firm's accounts were bleeding dry and the creditors were beginning to circle. Richard had pointed a trembling finger to the primary guarantor's signature lines. Jason remembered holding the heavy gold pen hovering over the blank spaces meant for his wife. He had justified the massive crime so easily in his mind. He told himself he was the head of the household, the primary financial provider, and that gave him the absolute, unshakable right to leverage her flawless credit score to save their legacy. He forged her name on document after document, binding her to millions of dollars in toxic debt without a single ounce of guilt. He had used her social security number as a shield to protect his own fragile ego. The most damning part of the entire crime was not just the forgery itself, but the sheer, unadulterated arrogance that allowed him to sleep soundly every night afterward. Jason had spent years convincing himself that his wife was completely incapable of understanding high-level corporate finance. He viewed her as a simple-minded woman whose only real talents were picking out expensive drapes and organizing elaborate birthday parties for their daughter. Whenever she asked a passing question about their taxes or bank statements, he would patronize her using complex financial jargon to confuse her into silence. He genuinely believed she was far too naive and far too trusting to ever dig into the deep, heavily fortified corporate filings of the Apex Financial Group. He had completely dismissed her degree because it came from a public state university, constantly comparing it to his own supposed elite education. He conveniently forgot that she was a highly trained forensic accountant whose entire career was built on hunting down hidden assets and exposing white-collar criminals. He thought he had successfully buried the fraudulent loans under layers of shell companies and corporate jargon. Instead, he had basically handed a loaded gun to a master marksman and then practically begged her to pull the trigger. The realization hit him with such intense force that his knees actually buckled. He grabbed the side mirror of his sedan to keep from collapsing onto the icy driveway. This was never a sudden emotional breakdown on her part. This was a calculated surgical financial autopsy that she had been conducting in total silence while sleeping in the exact same bed as him. Jason looked at Richard, his voice trembling with a mixture of absolute terror and rising fury. He explained the catastrophic reality of their situation to the old man. He told his father that they did not just bounce a check or miss a mortgage payment. They had submitted forged federally regulated documents to Chase Bank to secure $3 million under false pretenses. He spelled out the specific charges one by one, letting the gravity of the words sink into the freezing air. Aggravated identity theft, federal wire fraud, bank fraud. Each of those charges carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. They were not going to face a local judge in a civil family court. They were going to face the full wrath of the federal government. Richard shook his head rapidly, his teeth chattering from the cold and the shock. The older man desperately clung to his lifelong habit of talking his way out of consequences. He reached out and grabbed Jason's arm, his grip surprisingly strong for a man who had just lost everything. Richard insisted that they could fix this. He claimed they just needed to find her, sit her down, and explain that it was a simple misunderstanding to protect the family. He said they could promise to pay her back, maybe offer her a larger share of the assets in the divorce settlement. Richard actually believed he could still manipulate the situation with a few empty promises and a forced apology. Jason ripped his arm away from his father's grasp, looking at him with utter disgust. There were no assets left to offer. The house was sold. The accounts were frozen. The facade was completely obliterated. Jason finally realized that Clara was not a woman who could be bought or charmed. She had just orchestrated the most flawless, devastating revenge he had ever witnessed, all without raising her voice once. And the absolute worst part was knowing that he had handed her the exact blueprints to his own destruction. Jamal had not moved from his spot at the bottom of the porch steps. While Jason and Richard were entirely consumed by their own panic, screaming at each other over the howling autumn wind, Jamal had remained perfectly still. He listened to every single horrifying word of their confession. In his line of work as a senior risk analyst for a major commercial bank, Jamal sat through mandatory federal compliance and fraud detection training every single quarter. He knew the precise legal statutes. He knew the devastating federal sentencing guidelines for aggravated identity theft and wire fraud. He knew exactly what happened when the federal government decided to build a case against white-collar criminals. Jamal knew that the authorities did not just arrest the primary perpetrators. They cast a massive, unforgiving net. They froze the assets of anyone remotely connected to the fraudulent funds, seized properties, investigated extended family members, and permanently destroyed professional careers. His analytical mind raced rapidly, calculating the immediate blast radius of Richard and Jason's catastrophic stupidity. A cold sweat broke out across the back of his neck despite the freezing temperature. If he stayed on this property for one more minute, if he offered them a ride, or if he helped them in any capacity whatsoever, he risked becoming an accessory after the fact to a multi-million-dollar federal crime. Naomi, on the other hand, was completely oblivious to the legal avalanche hanging directly over their heads. She was shivering violently in her thin designer cocktail dress, rubbing her bare arms and complaining loudly about the freezing temperature. She took a step toward her father, whining that they needed to call an emergency locksmith right now because her feet were hurting in her heels and she desperately wanted to go inside. She reached out to comfort Richard completely, failing to understand that the man standing in front of her was no longer a wealthy, respected patriarch, but a ruined, unindicted felon. Before Naomi's hand could even touch her father's shoulder, Jamal moved. He stepped forward with a sudden, forceful urgency and firmly grabbed his wife by the upper arm. He pulled her back instantly, physically putting distance between her and the toxic epicenter of her family. Naomi gasped in shock, spinning around to glare at her husband. She aggressively demanded to know what he was doing, her voice shrill with indignation and entitlement. Jamal did not shout, but his voice carried a sharp, lethal intensity that instantly silenced her. He looked her dead in the eye and told her they were leaving right this exact second. Naomi protested, gesturing wildly toward her brother and father, saying they could not just abandon them outside in the freezing cold without their coats or wallets. Jamal tightened his grip slightly, leaning in close so there was absolutely no misinterpretation of his words. He explicitly stated that her father and brother had just openly confessed to committing massive federal financial crimes. He told her that as a licensed banking professional, his mere presence at this scene was a severe legal liability. He looked from Naomi to Richard, his expression hardening into pure disgust. He told his wife, "We are leaving now. I am not going to federal prison for your family." Jason spun around, his eyes wide and desperate. He took a frantic step toward Jamal, holding up his hands in a pathetic, pleading gesture. He begged his brother-in-law for help, asking for a quick ride to a hotel or a small cash loan just to get them through the night until they could figure things out. Richard chimed in, his voice shaking, demanding Jamal show some respect and family loyalty in their time of need. The sheer audacity of the demand made Jamal physically sick to his stomach. Jamal stepped back, holding up his hands in a firm gesture of total rejection. He looked directly at Jason and delivered a brutally honest assessment. He said there was absolutely no figuring things out. He explained that Clara was a highly trained forensic accountant who had just orchestrated a legally flawless asset seizure, gathered concrete evidence of abuse, and handed their daughter over to Child Protective Services. He told them that by tomorrow morning, the FBI and the IRS would be tearing their entire lives apart, piece by piece. He made it absolutely clear that he would not give them a single dime, he would not offer them a ride, and he would eagerly testify against them in a heartbeat to protect his own spotless career and freedom. Jamal turned his back on the two ruined men and began walking briskly toward his car. He hit the unlock button on his key fob, the headlights flashing brightly in the dark driveway. He opened the driver's side door and looked back at Naomi over the roof of the car. He gave her a final, non-negotiable ultimatum. He told her she could get in the passenger seat right now and go home to their safe, legally sound life, or she could stay on that freezing driveway with two federal criminals and figure it out on her own. He said he was starting the engine, and he was not going to wait. Naomi looked at her father, who was leaning weakly against Jason's car, and then at Jason, who looked like a cornered, terrified rat. For the first time in her entire life, the illusion of their superiority completely shattered in her mind. She saw them for exactly what they were. Without a single word of goodbye, Naomi hiked up her expensive dress and sprinted down the driveway. She threw herself into the passenger seat and slammed the door shut. Jamal immediately shifted the car into gear and accelerated down the street. The red taillights quickly disappeared into the night, abandoning Jason and Richard entirely to the dark, freezing reality of their complete and utter destruction. I was already miles away, pulling into the brightly lit parking lot of the police precinct to finally hold my daughter, but I knew exactly the sequence of events unfolding back at the dark suburban estate. The corporate holding firm I had sold the property to operated with zero tolerance for trespassers and lingering liabilities. They did not leave their newly acquired assets unguarded. Jamal's taillights faded into the pitch-black night, taking the very last shred of Jason's hope with them. The heavy silence of the neighborhood rushed back in, broken only by the harsh, biting wind whistling through the bare oak trees. Jason stood frozen next to his sedan, his breath pluming in white clouds in the freezing air. Beside him, Richard looked like a deflated balloon. His expensive Tom Ford suit offered absolutely zero protection against the plunging Chicago temperature. They were entirely alone. The realization of their profound isolation settled over them like a physical weight. There was no one left to call, no one to manipulate. Jason reached blindly for the door handle of his car, desperate for the sanctuary of a heated leather seat to escape the biting wind. Before his fingers could even grasp the frozen metal, a pair of blinding white spotlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the driveway with the intensity of a stadium. A heavy armored black SUV with flashing amber light bars on the roof, aggressively turned onto the property, its thick tires crunching over the frost-covered concrete. It pulled up at a sharp angle, deliberately blocking Jason's sedan from the street. The side of the vehicle was emblazoned with the logo of a premier private security firm, the exact firm hired by Apex Holdings to protect their vacant real estate investments. Two massive security guards stepped out of the heavy SUV. They were not friendly neighborhood watch volunteers. They were dressed in full tactical winter gear, wearing heavy coats and carrying thick metal flashlights. The lead guard, a tall man with a stone-cold expression, walked directly toward Jason and Richard. He did not ask how their evening was going. He did not ask for their side of the story. He simply raised his flashlight, shining the beam directly into Jason's eyes, and informed them that they were trespassing on private corporate property. He pointed to the legal notice still taped to the front door and stated that they had exactly 2 minutes to vacate the premises entirely. Jason threw up his hands to block the blinding light. His ingrained arrogance briefly flared back to life despite his freezing limbs. He puffed out his chest desperately, trying to summon the authoritative executive tone he had used to banish me to the back of the ballroom just hours earlier. He demanded the guard lower the flashlight, claiming there had been a massive legal misunderstanding, and that he just needed to get into his car to turn on the heater. The guard did not flinch. He did not lower the light. Instead, he tapped the screen of the rugged tablet strapped to his wrist. He coldly informed Jason that the vehicle was parked on private property without authorization, and a tow truck had already been dispatched. If Jason attempted to start the engine or remain on the driveway, he would be physically detained and handcuffed for criminal trespass until the local police returned. Richard let out a pathetic whimper, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. He grabbed Jason's sleeve, pulling him back from the guard. The older man was completely broken, utterly terrified of spending his first night in a holding cell. He begged Jason to just do exactly what the guard said. The guard gestured toward the broken cardboard boxes scattered across the icy concrete. He ordered them to pick up their personal belongings and step past the property line onto the public municipal sidewalk immediately. It was the ultimate degrading eviction. Jason, the man who had always demanded absolute respect and submission, was now being ordered to pick up his trash and walk away. With freezing, numb fingers, Jason knelt down on the icy driveway. He clumsily scooped up his custom-tailored shirts and imported leather shoes, shoving them back into the torn cardboard boxes. Richard tried to help, but his hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold his own collection of vintage watches. The security guards stood over them like wardens, their expressions completely devoid of pity. Once their arms were full of the cheap broken boxes, the guard pointed his heavy flashlight toward the end of the driveway. Jason and Richard stumbled down the slate walkway, their expensive leather shoes slipping on the gathering frost. They crossed the invisible boundary line separating the $2 million estate from the public street. The moment their feet hit the sidewalk, the security guards stepped back, forming a solid human wall at the entrance of the driveway. Jason looked back at the massive dark house that was supposed to be his untouchable fortress. He had nothing left but a flimsy cardboard box of clothes and a father who had ruined his life. The freezing Chicago night swallowed them whole as they began their long, pathetic walk down the dark street, with absolutely nowhere to go. 10 miles away from the dark suburban estate they used to call home, Jason and Richard sat in deafening silence inside a room at the Starlight Motel. The neon sign outside the window buzzed with a loud electrical hum, casting a sickly, pulsating red glow through the thin, stained curtains. The small room smelled heavily of stale cigarettes and cheap industrial bleach. There were no vaulted ceilings here, no marble foyers, and no Tom Ford suits hanging in a custom cedar closet. There were only 2 sagging double beds covered in scratchy polyester bedspreads, and a flickering television mounted to the wall. Jason sat on the edge of the mattress, his tailored suit completely ruined. His expensive leather shoes were scuffed from the icy concrete, and his tie hung loosely around his neck like a noose. He was staring blankly at the peeling floral wallpaper, his mind entirely unable to process the absolute freefall his life had taken in a matter of hours. Richard was hunched over a small laminate desk in the corner, his head buried deep in his hands. The older man was trembling uncontrollably. The crushing reality of their federal crimes hung in the stale air, suffocating them. They were broke, homeless, abandoned by their family, and waiting for the inevitable knock of federal agents. Far away from the depressing neon buzz of that motel, I was experiencing a completely different reality. I sat comfortably at the polished granite island of my secure luxury high-rise apartment, overlooking the glowing Chicago skyline. Lily was fast asleep down the hall, tucked safely into a warm bed, completely insulated from the toxic chaos of her father. I poured myself a glass of expensive red wine, feeling the smooth liquid warm my chest. I opened my laptop, the bright screen illuminating the dark kitchen. I navigated to my encrypted email server and pulled up a draft I had meticulously prepared weeks ago. As a forensic accountant, I did not deal in vague accusations or emotional rants. I dealt in cold, hard, undeniable data. The attachments in this drafted email were lethal. I had created high-definition color-coded spreadsheets, tracing every single dollar flowing in and out of Richard's supposed prestigious investment firm. The documents clearly and irrefutably illustrated how Richard had been running a textbook Ponzi scheme for the last 36 months. I mapped out the entire network of fake shell companies. I showed exactly how he used the capital from new investors to pay off the older ones, illegally skimming the top, to lease his luxury vehicles, pay his exorbitant country club dues, and buy his designer watches. The recipient list in the blind copy field was an absolute masterpiece of social destruction. It included every single wealthy investor who had attended Lily's birthday party just hours earlier. It included the entire board of directors at the Oak Brook Country Club. It included Richard's elite golfing buddies, his fierce business competitors, and the top financial journalists in the city. I took a slow sip of my wine. I looked at the digital clock in the corner of my screen as it struck midnight. Without a single ounce of hesitation or regret, I firmly clicked send. The massive digital payload flew silently through the servers, instantly landing in the private inboxes of Chicago's most powerful and ruthless people. Back in the miserable motel room, the heavy silence was violently shattered. Richard's phone, resting on the cheap laminate desk, began to vibrate wildly against the wood. A second later, Jason's phone lit up in his pocket. It was a synchronized symphony of absolute digital panic. Jason pulled his phone out with shaking hands. The caller identification displayed the name of the lead New York investor from the country club bar. Jason swiped to answer, his voice cracking desperately, hoping for a lifeline or a simple misunderstanding. Instead, the man on the other end of the line was screaming at the top of his lungs. The investor demanded to know if the spreadsheets he just received were accurate. He screamed about federal regulators demanding his money back immediately and threatening to unleash a team of vicious corporate lawyers to strip Jason and Richard down to their bones. Before Jason could even form a pathetic, stuttering excuse, the powerful man hung up. Richard's phone kept ringing relentlessly. Text messages flooded both of their screens in rapid succession. Words like fraud, liar, criminal, and SEC investigation flashed brightly in the red neon light of the motel room. The wealthy men who had eagerly laughed at Richard's jokes earlier that evening were now actively hunting him. The elite high society world that Jason and Richard had worshipped, the world they had sacrificed their morals and my identity to be a part of, was permanently slamming its doors shut. They were not just financially ruined, they were socially annihilated. Every bridge they had ever built was burned to ash in a matter of seconds. The elite circles of Chicago would not just shun them, they would actively work to destroy them to protect their own reputations and capital. Jason dropped his phone onto the cheap carpet, watching the screen light up with another furious threat. He looked over at his father, who was staring at the endless barrage of angry messages with hollow, lifeless eyes. The fake billionaire patriarch and his arrogant heir had been reduced to absolute nothingness in a single night. The harsh morning light filtering through the cheap motel curtains did absolutely nothing to wash away the absolute catastrophe of the previous night. Yet somehow, against all logic and reason, Jason and Richard woke up with a renewed toxic sense of entitlement. Denial is a powerful drug for men who have never faced real consequences. Richard convinced Jason that the mass email was just a desperate tactic from a bitter wife. He argued that the wealthy investors were just panicking temporarily, and that a top-tier legal bulldog could easily secure an injunction, freeze my offshore assets, and force me to hand the keys to the estate back over. Jason eagerly swallowed the lie, desperate to regain his alpha status. They put their wrinkled, scuffed suits back on, splashing cold water on their faces, and completely ignored the terrifying reality of the federal crimes they had confessed to in the driveway. They could not rent a car, and their credit cards were entirely useless, so Richard was forced to humiliate himself by calling a former junior associate to beg for a prepaid rideshare. They rode in the back of a standard sedan toward the towering glass and steel skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. Jason spent the entire ride rehearsing the vicious, fabricated allegations he was going to present to the divorce attorney. He planned to accuse me of severe mental instability, financial embezzlement, and child endangerment. He was completely convinced that if he just played the victim loudly enough, the legal system would automatically side with him, just as his family always had. They arrived at the prestigious offices of Montgomery and Pierce, a high-end family law firm known for utterly destroying opposing spouses. Jason pushed through the heavy glass double doors with his head held high, marching across the thick plush carpet like he still owned the entire city. Richard trailed closely behind, adjusting his ruined tie, trying to project the aura of a wealthy patriarch protecting his son. The waiting room was a sanctuary of wealth, featuring imported leather sofas, abstract art, and sweeping views of Lake Michigan. Jason approached the sleek marble reception desk, heavily slapping his palm against the stone. He loudly demanded that the senior partner see them immediately, claiming it was an absolute emergency regarding a multi-million-dollar marital estate. Jason expected the young receptionist to immediately jump out of her chair, offer them sparkling water, and usher them into a corner office. That is how the world had always responded to his demands. Instead, the young woman staring back at him was completely pale. Her hands were visibly shaking over her keyboard. She did not ask for his name or offer a polite corporate greeting. She just swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward the heavy oak doors leading to the interior conference rooms. Jason frowned, his arrogance flaring up, and he opened his mouth to deliver a harsh reprimand about her poor customer service. Before Jason could speak a single word, the heavy oak doors swung open. But it was not a high-priced divorce attorney in a bespoke suit who stepped out to greet them. It was three men wearing incredibly plain, off-the-rack government suits. They did not have the polished, eager smiles of men looking to secure a wealthy new client. They had the cold, clinical expressions of apex predators who had finally cornered their prey. The waiting room suddenly felt incredibly small and suffocatingly quiet. The man in the center stepped forward, his posture rigid and commanding. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a heavy gold shield. He loudly identified himself as a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The man to his right, holding a thick manila folder completely packed with the forensic accounting spreadsheets I had provided, introduced himself as a criminal investigator for the Internal Revenue Service. They read Jason and Richard's full legal names out loud, the words echoing sharply off the marble walls of the reception area. The senior partner of the law firm finally peeked out from behind the agents, his face an absolute mask of professional distance. He coldly informed Jason that his firm did not represent individuals actively under federal investigation for wire fraud, and that he had been legally obligated to notify the authorities the moment Jason scheduled the emergency appointment. Jason felt the blood completely drain from his head. He looked at the FBI agents, then back at his father. Richard was already backing away, his hands trembling violently, staring at the IRS investigator. They had marched confidently into what they thought was their war room, completely oblivious to the fact that I had already turned it into their federal holding cell. The trap had slammed shut, and there was absolutely no way out. The FBI agents did not give Jason or Richard a single moment to process the absolute collapse of their reality. The lead agent stepped forward, his voice cutting through the dead silence of the luxury waiting room. He recited their Miranda rights with a cold, mechanical efficiency, that made the terrifying words sound like a casual routine. Before Jason could even form a coherent sentence of protest, heavy steel handcuffs were locked securely around his wrists. The cold metal bit into his skin, a harsh physical reminder that his days of wearing tailored suits and giving orders were permanently over. Richard offered absolutely no resistance. He simply held out his trembling hands, tears streaming down his wrinkled face, completely broken by the federal reality crashing down upon him. They were escorted out of the prestigious law firm in absolute disgrace. The junior associates and wealthy clients in the hallway stopped and stared, whispering eagerly as the supposed billionaire patriarch and his arrogant son were paraded to the elevator in chains. They were loaded into the back of two separate unmarked government SUVs waiting on the busy Chicago street. The ride to the Dirksen Federal Building was completely silent. Jason stared out the tinted window at the towering skyscrapers he used to pretend he owned. He was entirely stripped of his power, his phone, and his illusions. The Federal Building was a stark, unforgiving contrast to the country clubs and luxury estates Jason was accustomed to. There was no mahogany paneling or ambient jazz music. There were only harsh fluorescent lights, scuffed linoleum floors, and doors secured by heavy electronic keypads. Jason and Richard were marched down a long, sterile corridor and led into a massive, windowless conference room. The agents pointed to two bolted metal chairs on one side of a long steel table. Jason sat down, his chained hands resting heavily on his lap. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. He expected the door to open and a team of aggressive federal prosecutors to walk in, ready to interrogate them into a confession. The heavy metal door clicked and swung open. But it was not a prosecutor who walked into the room. I was already inside the building, and the lead FBI agent politely held the door open for me. I walked into the interrogation room wearing a sharp, tailored navy blue business suit. I did not look like the submissive, working-class wife Jason loved to insult. I looked exactly like the senior forensic auditor I was. I carried a thick leather briefcase which I placed firmly onto the steel table. The IRS investigator followed closely behind me, pushing a metal rolling cart stacked high with heavy expanding file folders. Every single folder was meticulously labeled, color-coded, and packed with the damning financial evidence I had quietly harvested from their home network. I pulled out a chair opposite Jason and sat down, folding my hands neatly on top of the table. I looked directly into his wide, terrified eyes. My expression was completely flat, entirely devoid of the fear or obedience he was so used to seeing. For a few seconds, Jason was entirely paralyzed by shock. His brain could simply not reconcile the image of his banished wife sitting confidently alongside federal agents. But as the IRS investigator began pulling thick stacks of forged loan applications and highlighted bank statements from the cart, laying them out across the table, the shock rapidly morphed into sheer, unhinged fury. Jason slammed his handcuffed fists against the steel table. The metal chains rattled violently, echoing off the bare walls. He lunged forward as far as the agents would allow, screaming at the top of his lungs. He called me a traitor. He shrieked that I was a psychopath who had completely ruined his life and destroyed his family out of petty jealousy. He demanded to know how I could possibly do this to the man who gave me a luxurious life. He yelled that I belonged in a psych ward, completely unable to accept his own massive culpability. The two FBI agents immediately stepped forward, placing their heavy hands on Jason's shoulders to forcefully press him back into his bolted chair. They ordered him to remain silent. I raised my hand slightly, looking at the lead agent, and offered a calm, polite smile. I told the agent it was perfectly fine, and that my soon-to-be ex-husband just needed a moment to adjust to his new reality. I turned my attention back to Jason. He was panting heavily, his face red and slick with sweat. I let the silence stretch out, forcing him to feel the immense, suffocating weight of the room. When I finally spoke, my voice was smooth, cold, and devastatingly precise. I reminded him of the birthday party. I reminded him of the exact moment he ripped my name card from the VIP table and threw it toward the kitchen. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the absolute truth. I told him, "You told me to sit in the back." So I did. I sat in the back for 2 entire years. I sat in the dark while you slept auditing your fake shell companies, tracing every single cent of your federal wire fraud, and documenting every forged signature you put on those loan applications. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table, closing the distance between us. I told him he always thought I was too stupid to understand his business. But the truth was, his business was just a pathetic, sloppy lie, and I was the one who finally balanced the books. The look of pure, agonizing realization that washed over Jason's face in that exact moment was the greatest payoff of my entire life. Jason sat completely paralyzed in the bolted metal chair, his chest heaving as the sheer magnitude of his catastrophic failure finally washed over him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The arrogant, untouchable executive had been entirely stripped away, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, broken man. I leaned back in my chair, allowing a long moment of heavy silence to stretch across the interrogation room. I wanted him to feel the walls closing in. I turned to the IRS investigator sitting beside me, offering a brief professional nod of mutual respect before turning my absolute focus back to my husband. I decided it was time to explain the exact anatomy of his destruction. I kept my voice perfectly level, the tone of a teacher explaining a simple mathematical equation to a slow student. I told Jason that his greatest mistake was not just underestimating my intelligence, but fundamentally misunderstanding the law. He genuinely thought that forging my signature and using my social security number was his brilliant loophole. He believed it made me a liable, helpless scapegoat for his failing empire. In reality, his decision to commit identity theft against his own wife handed me the ultimate trump card. Under federal financial regulations, a documented victim of identity theft holds supreme authority over the compromised accounts. Once I compiled the initial batch of evidence regarding the forged Chase Bank loans, I realized a standard divorce attorney was completely useless. I was not going to waste my time sitting in a local family court fighting over pennies in a settlement while he hid his stolen assets. I went straight to the top. Exactly 6 months ago, I walked directly into the Internal Revenue Service whistleblower office. I handed them a perfectly curated, fully indexed portfolio of his entire fraudulent operation. The federal agents did not have to spend years digging through complex shell companies or waiting on slow subpoenas to build their case. I had already done all the heavy lifting for them. For the last half year, I operated as a covert asset inside his own home. Every single time Jason bragged about a new country club membership, an expensive vacation, or a luxury car lease, I was silently logging the wire transfers. I cross-referenced his lavish spending with the completely fabricated corporate tax returns he and Richard were filing with the government. I built an airtight financial cage around him, steel bar by steel bar, and he was completely oblivious. He was far too busy playing the role of a wealthy elite to notice the federal noose slowly tightening around his own neck. Jason swallowed hard, the heavy metal handcuffs rattling against the steel table as his hands shook. His voice was reduced to a pathetic hoarse whisper when he finally managed to ask me why I chose today. He asked why I waited for the exact day of our daughter's birthday party to pull the trigger. I smiled, a cold and predatory expression that made him flinch. I explained that executing a simultaneous multi-agency asset freeze and a rapid corporate real estate transfer required extreme surgical precision. I needed a solid block of time where Jason was completely distracted, physically separated from me, and entirely unable to access his banking applications. I originally planned to fake a sudden migraine and leave the country club early to initiate the sequence. But Jason, in his infinite blind arrogance, provided a much better solution. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table, closing the distance between us. I told him that by marching up to me, ripping my name card from the table, and loudly demanding I leave the main ballroom, he orchestrated his own demise. He aggressively kicked me out in front of his wealthy investors and dozens of party guests. I explained the absolute legal perfection of that moment. He handed me an ironclad, publicly witnessed alibi. When the banks began freezing the surety bonds and locking down the credit cards, nobody could ever claim I was acting as his willing co-conspirator. He publicly severed our partnership. He gave me the exact operational window I needed to sit in the quiet sanctuary of my SUV and execute the master kill switch without him looking over my shoulder to stop me. There was no legal battle left to fight. I explained that there would be no prolonged, messy divorce trial over the $2 million estate. The house was already sold legally under my private LLC, and the cash was sitting securely in an offshore trust that the federal investigators had already cleared as my lawful, untainted inheritance. Everything else, the bank accounts, the cars, the fake investment firm, now belonged entirely to the federal government as evidence of his massive criminal enterprise. I did not just leave him. I trapped him in a cage of his own making, and I threw away the key. Jason stared at me, his eyes wide and completely hollow. The realization that I had not only caught him, but had meticulously orchestrated his downfall for 6 months was finally penetrating his thick skull. He had spent years treating me like a naive child, a convenient prop in his fake billionaire lifestyle. Now he was sitting across from me in handcuffs facing decades in federal prison, and I was the one holding the absolute power. The FBI agents stood silently behind him, their presence a solid wall of inevitable justice. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat with manic energy. I spoke with the calm, precise articulation of an auditor delivering a final damning report. I wanted him to understand the absolute totality of his defeat. I told him that the most satisfying part of this entire process was not just catching him in the act of federal wire fraud. It was not even the moment I watched his precious country club cards get declined at the bar. The true masterpiece, the final devastating blow, was the financial reality of what was about to happen next. I leaned back slightly in my chair, folding my hands neatly on the table. I reminded Jason that he always loved to brag about his financial acumen. He loved to lecture me about high-yield investments and capital gains, pretending he was some sort of Wall Street genius while secretly forging my name on fraudulent loans. I told him that it was finally time for me to give him a real lesson in advanced finance. I looked him dead in the eye and explained the specific legal structure of the Internal Revenue Service whistleblower office. I told him that under United States federal law, the government heavily incentivizes citizens to report massive financial crimes. When a whistleblower provides concrete, actionable evidence that leads to the successful recovery of stolen funds or unpaid taxes, the IRS does not just offer a polite thank you. They offer a substantial, legally binding financial reward. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, forcing him to hang on my every word. I explained that the standard payout for a successful whistleblower claim is between 15 and 30% of the total amount the government recovers. I watched Jason's throat bob as he swallowed hard, his analytical brain finally starting to do the terrifying math. I delivered the final crushing numbers. I told him that according to the extensive spreadsheets I had provided to the federal agents sitting right next to me, he and Richard had successfully defrauded the banks and the government out of exactly $5 million. I explained that the FBI had already moved to seize and liquidate all remaining assets hidden in those offshore shell companies. The government was going to recover every single dime. I leaned forward again, making sure he could not look away from my face. I told him that because I was the one who handed them the entire case on a silver platter, I was legally entitled to the maximum payout. I said so, by the way, since you defrauded them of $5 million, I am going to receive a $1.5 million check directly from the federal government for turning you in. Jason gasped, a sharp, ragged sound that echoed off the bare metal walls of the interrogation room. The absolute poetic justice of the situation was finally clear to him. Not only had I completely destroyed his life, not only had I secured the $2 million house sale in my private offshore account, but I was actually going to get spectacularly rich off of his own massive criminal stupidity. He had tried to use me to steal millions, and instead he had just funded my entire future. He opened his mouth to scream, to curse me, to unleash the toxic rage that had always been his default defense mechanism. But the lead FBI agent stepped forward immediately, gripping Jason firmly by the shoulder. The agent looked down at him and stated coldly that the interview was officially over. He informed Jason that he was being remanded into federal custody and would be transported to the Metropolitan Correctional Center to await his arraignment hearing. The two agents hauled Jason up from the bolted chair. His legs wobbled, barely able to support his own weight. He looked back at me one last time as they dragged him toward the heavy metal door. There was no arrogance left in his eyes. There was no defiance. There was only the absolute soul-crushing realization that he had played a high-stakes game of deception against a master, and he had lost absolutely everything. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, with a final, echoing thud. I sat alone in the quiet interrogation room, surrounded by the boxed evidence of his ruined life. I slowly packed my laptop back into my briefcase, snapped the locks shut, and walked out of the federal building into the crisp, clean Chicago air. Even through the heavy steel door of the interrogation room, I could hear the exact moment Jason completely broke. A loud, guttural sob echoed down the sterile federal corridor, followed by the frantic, pathetic sounds of a man hyperventilating as the reality of a federal prison sentence finally crushed his massive ego. It was not a dignified silence. It was the messy, humiliating breakdown of a bully who had just been stripped of his armor and his illusions. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I simply picked up my leather briefcase, walked out of the Dirksen Federal Building, and stepped into the crisp Chicago air. For the first time in 5 years, I took a deep, clean breath that belonged entirely to me. The next 3 months moved with a rapid, highly efficient velocity. When you hand the federal government a perfectly wrapped package of forensic evidence, the justice system moves incredibly fast. Jason and Richard did not even attempt to fight the charges. Their high-priced defense attorneys took one look at the sheer volume of documented wire fraud, the forged signatures, and the fabricated tax returns, and immediately advised them to take a plea deal. They both plead guilty to multiple counts of aggravated identity theft and bank fraud. The elite society that Richard had spent his entire life trying to impress completely turned their backs on him. They were both sentenced to significant time in a federal penitentiary. The divorce was finalized with zero friction. Jason was sitting in a federal holding facility, wearing a standard-issued jumpsuit with absolutely zero assets to his name, making the division of property remarkably simple. The judge granted me permanent sole legal and physical custody of Lily, completely severing our last remaining tie to that toxic bloodline. Naomi and the rest of the extended family never reached out to me, too ashamed of their own behavior and terrified of being implicated in the massive financial fallout. The harsh, freezing winds of Chicago are now nothing more than a distant memory. I traded the dark, suffocating suburban estate for the endless, bright horizon of the Pacific Ocean. I am currently sitting on the warm, golden sands of a private beach in Laguna Beach, Southern California. The sun is shining brightly, casting a brilliant, warm glow over the crashing waves. A few yards away, Lily is happily digging in the sand with a bright plastic shovel, her laughter mixing perfectly with the rhythmic sound of the ocean. She is building a massive sandcastle, completely unaware of the absolute chaos and destruction her father brought upon himself. She has flourished in these last 3 months, surrounded only by peace, stability, and unconditional love. There are no more passive-aggressive comments. There are no more tense family dinners. There is just the two of us building a beautiful new life entirely on our own terms. I lean back against my comfortable beach chair and reach into my canvas tote bag. I pull out my phone and unlock the screen. For a long time, looking at my phone meant anticipating an angry text from Jason or a demanding, demeaning message from his sister. Now my screen only delivers absolute peace. I open my secure banking application, the one tied directly to the private offshore trust I established during the real estate sale. The balance from the house sale, $2,100,000, has been sitting safely untouched. But today, there is a new pending transaction. It is a direct wire transfer from the United States Treasury Department. It is the finalized whistleblower reward payout from the Internal Revenue Service. I watch the loading wheel spin for a fraction of a second before the screen refreshes. The bold green numbers populate on the screen. Exactly $1,500,000 has been successfully deposited into my account. The federal government seized every last dime of Richard's fraudulent empire, and they compensated me beautifully for handing them the keys. Between the cash from the house and the federal reward, I am sitting on over $3.5 million of completely clean, legally protected liquid assets. I lock the screen of my phone and toss it carelessly back into my beach bag. I do not need to look at the numbers anymore. I know exactly what I am worth, and I know exactly what I am capable of. I take off my sunglasses, letting the warm California sun wash over my face. I watch Lily place a seashell on top of her sandcastle, her bright smile radiating pure joy. If you are watching this and you feel trapped in a situation where people are underestimating your intelligence and tearing down your worth, let my story be your ultimate sign. Do not scream. Do not argue. Just sit quietly in the back, gather your evidence, and build your trap. The sweetest revenge is not just destroying the people who tried to break you. The sweetest revenge is walking away completely free, brilliantly victorious, and living a beautiful life they can never touch again. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had to walk away to find your freedom. Hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of surviving and thriving. The gripping story of Clara's meticulous dismantling of her husband and father-in-law's fraudulent empire offers a profound lesson. True power rarely roars. It plans. For years, Clara endured humiliation, gaslighting, and financial betrayal from men who mistook her silence for compliance and her patience for weakness. The core lesson here is the immense value of silent preparation and knowing your own worth when dealing with toxic people. Often, when we face narcissism or overt disrespect, our immediate instinct is to react loudly to defend ourselves, argue back, or prove our abusers wrong in the heat of the moment. However, Clara demonstrates that reacting emotionally only gives toxic individuals the drama and control they crave. Instead, she channeled her pain into strategy. She understood that her intelligence and professional skills were her greatest assets, choosing to build an airtight exit strategy rather than wasting energy on empty arguments. Furthermore, the story highlights the fatal danger of arrogance. Jason and Richard were so blinded by their own illusions of grandeur and their perceived superiority that they handed Clara the very tools she needed to defeat them. They underestimated her simply because she didn't fit their superficial definition of power. Clara's ultimate victory wasn't just about the financial whistleblower reward. It was about reclaiming her identity, enforcing ironclad boundaries, and protecting her daughter. She proved that when you stop seeking validation from those who are determined to belittle you, you become truly unstoppable. Ultimately, this narrative reminds us that we never have to accept the diminishing roles toxic people try to assign to us. We have the absolute right to quietly secure our peace and step into our freedom. Share this reflection with someone who needs the courage to start prioritizing their own worth today.